عارضون 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 عارضون.
One of the most critical questions in the Bible is, how are we to understand the nature of God? Should we understand God as being a three-part being, a trinity, or should we understand God as a simple absolute unity, God being one? And one of the passages that comes up most frequently in this discussion is Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, where God says, "Let us make man." Trinitarians argue that this is a very, very strong source for their belief in a three-part God. Obviously, though, this doesn't necessarily flow from the expression, "let us make man." It could equally be argued that God has two parts, or God is a quaternity of four parts. It doesn't necessarily flow from an expression, "let us make man," that God has three parts. However, it's important to understand that most serious Christian scholars are quick to admit that their belief in a Trinity is not really something that can be derived from the Hebrew Scriptures. Robert Bowman, who wrote one of the definitive books on the Trinity called Why You Should Believe in the Trinity, admits in his book that this concept is one which is simply not found directly in the Jewish Bible. So what does it mean when God says, "Let us make man"? Who is God speaking to? And I'd like to share four approaches, two of which are found both in Jewish and Christian commentaries to the Bible. The first is that God is speaking to his heavenly host, to the angels. And God addresses the angels and says, "Let us make man." And the question is, why would God bother addressing the angels? And the rabbis of the Talmud explain that God is really teaching us here an important ethical, moral principle, that a superior should not disregard their subordinates. A superior should consult with them and include them in the decision-making process. And so to teach this very important ethical principle, ethical lesson, so God expresses this in the beginning of the Bible in creating the human being, saying, "Let us make man." A second approach, which is also discussed both in Jewish and Christian sources, is that the Bible here is employing what is referred to as the royal we. That in both literature and scripture, we find that majesty, the king or queen, will often speak in the first person plural. So the king will often say, "What shall we do at this time?" And so too here in Genesis 1:26, God says, "Let us make man." A third approach is found in the Jewish medieval Bible scholar Moses Nachmanides, the Ramban, who says that the creation of man is really a dual creation. It comes from two parts. The human being was created both from the earth and by God breathing into the earth his breath and giving the human being a soul. So Nachmanides explains that in the creation of man, God really addresses the earth, the world. And God says to the world, "Let us make man." You, the world, will give the physical component of the human being from the earth, and I, God, will give the human being the spiritual component, his soul, by the breath. The fourth approach is offered by Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement in Judaism, and he says something fascinating and inspiring. The Baal Shem Tov says that really everything else that was created, God was able to create unilaterally, simply by saying, "Let there be. Let there be light, let there be trees, let there be bears, let there be stars." But when it comes to the human being, God is basically saying, "I cannot create a human being all by myself. I can give this person a body and a soul, but what this person will become is a function of what they do with those raw ingredients." So the Baal Shem Tov says that God is really addressing every human being who will ever live. And God is saying to each human being, "Let us make you. You will use the raw ingredients, the body and the soul that I will give you, but what you will become will be a masterpiece that only you can create. I can't make you. And so God addresses each one of us and says, let us make man. We find this idea elaborated upon by the Maharal, the famous Jewish philosopher in the Middle Ages, who says that the Bible tells us that that human being will be called Adam, because he comes from the Adamah, from the earth. And the Maharal explains that the earth is significant in that it is pure potential. A field, a plot of land, if it's worked properly and cultivated by plowing it and fertilizing it and planting it and watering it and tending it, can be very productive and produce a beautiful crop, a beautiful field. However, if the land is really neglected and not used properly, nothing will come out of it. And so the human being is very similar. The Adam comes from the Adamah. And just as the earth, the Adamah, is pure potential, the human being that God created is pure potential. What we become is a function of what we do with those raw ingredients that we were given.